The bullet hit the canyon wall 3 inches from Wallace Easton's skull, and the sound of it ricocheted through Redemption Valley like the crack of God's own whip. He pressed his back flat against the sandstone, breathing hard through his nose, his Colt revolver gripped in his right hand so tightly that his knuckles had gone the color of bleached bone. Dust fell from the impact point and settled across the brim of his hat like a fine orange snow. He counted his heartbeats the way a man counts his last coins. 1, 2, 3. There were 8 of Dorian Creed's men on the ridge above him. He had 3 bullets left in his cylinder. The numbers did not work in his favor. They had never worked in his favor in this valley. And now, with the northern pass blasted shut by Creed's dynamite and the southern route flooded from the spring thaw, he had been cornered as completely as any man could be cornered. Redemption Valley had become his coffin, and the lid was being nailed shut from the outside. He had ridden in 3 days ago on the trail of Creed's operation, a bounty that stretched across 4 territories and promised enough gold to buy his way out of the life that had been slowly killing him since he was 19 years old. He had been so certain that the valley was a pass-through, a shortcut, a clever tactical advantage. Instead, it had become a trap, and the man who had set it, Dorian Creed, had been expecting him. The betrayal of that realization still burned at the center of his chest. Someone had told Creed he was coming. Someone had given away his route. He had no way of knowing who, and in 3 days of being hunted through the scrub and the dry creek beds and the ruined canyon passages of this valley, he had not had time to think hard enough to figure it out. He had only had time to survive. Another bullet sang past the lip of his shelter. They were getting closer. They were walking their shots down toward him like a man walking steps down a staircase, patient, methodical, certain. That was when he heard her voice. It came from behind him, from the rock face itself, low and direct and carrying absolutely no trace of fear. "You keep standing there and they'll have you sighted in the next 2 minutes. There is a crack in the wall 4 feet to your left. You get through it, you follow my lamp. You argue with me right now and you die. Those are your choices." Wallace turned his head. He had not heard a single footstep. He had not heard a single breath, and he had the hearing of a man who had kept himself alive for 12 years by listening to things other men could not detect. Yet there she was. A woman, perhaps 25 years old, with dark hair pinned under a wide-brimmed hat and a buffalo hide satchel slung across her back, standing against the rock wall in a shadow so precise that she might have been part of the stone itself. Her eyes, even in the dimness, were the color of deep river water, a dark and complex gray-green that held an intelligence so sharp it cut at him. "Who are you?" he asked. "I am the person keeping you from being buried in this valley," she said. "My name is Josephine Hale. The crack, Mr. Easton, move." He had exactly 1 second to wonder how she knew his name before another volley of shots chewed into the sandstone above him, and the decision was made for him by the most democratic force in the world. Survival. He moved. To understand how Wallace Easton came to be running for his life through a crack in the earth with a woman he had never met, you would need to go back 4 days, to the moment he rode into the mining settlement of Harrow's Creek and saw the bounty notice posted on the door of the assay office. Dorian Creed, wanted for robbery, murder, extortion, and the illegal seizure of mineral claims across 3 territories. The reward was $2,000, dead or alive. For a man who had been surviving on 50-cent bounties and the occasional cattle escort, it was a number that made his vision go white at the edges. Wallace Easton was 29 years old. He had been carrying a gun professionally since he was 17, when a traveling bounty hunter named Cole Marsh had taken him on as a deputy tracker following the massacre at his father's ranch. An event that had left him alone in the world with nothing but a horse, a revolver, and a talent for reading landscapes that bordered on the supernatural. 12 years of chasing dangerous men across dangerous country had made him hard in ways that went beyond the physical. There was a place behind his eyes that had gone quiet and watchful in a way that most people found unsettling. He did not smile easily. He did not trust easily. He did not stay anywhere long enough to become known. He was not, by any honest accounting of the evidence, a man who was looking for anything beyond the next bounty and a clear road out of the territory. But $2,000 was $2,000. And Creed's trail, according to 3 separate sources in Harrow's Creek, led directly through Redemption Valley. He had made inquiries. The valley was a natural corridor, carved by an old riverbed, flanked by high sandstone walls, with a northern pass that opened onto the mesa country beyond. It was the fastest route to the mine settlement of Caldera, where Creed was known to be operating. It was also, as 3 separate people in Harrow's Creek had failed to mention, a valley that Dorian Creed controlled with the kind of iron certainty that comes from owning the only way in and the only way out. He discovered this on his second morning in the valley when he found the northern pass blocked, not by rockfall, by deliberate demolition. Someone had used enough explosive powder to bring down a significant section of the canyon wall, and the rubble was fresh, pale-sided where it had been split, still carrying the acrid ghost of black powder in the morning air. The southern route, which should have offered an alternate exit, was a churning brown flood from the snowmelt that had been running heavy for 2 weeks. He had tested the depth with a lodgepole he found near an abandoned prospector's camp, and found it ran 8 feet deep in the shallows. Crossing it was not an option. He had been considering his position with the practiced calm of a man who has been in bad situations before when the first shot came. It was not a warning. It was aimed to kill, and it had missed his shoulder by less than 3 inches. He had spent the following 36 hours doing what he did best, which was survive in hostile terrain. He knew the canyon's geography better than most men after 2 days in it, knew where the shadow pools were at midday, and how the rock formations created natural rifle blinds, and where the water collected in stone basins on the second terrace. He had used all of this knowledge with methodical precision. And he had still been running out of options with the arithmetic-like certainty of a man watching his last candle burn down. And then Josephine Hale had appeared out of the rock itself and offered him an underground route. The crack in the wall was narrow enough that he had to turn sideways and press himself through with the sandstone scraping his chest and his back simultaneously. And for one long, chest-tightening moment he thought he was going to be wedged there when the walls pinched. But then the rock opened up, and he was through, and the temperature dropped 20 degrees in an instant. He could smell it before he could see it properly. Water, deep and cold and ancient, and something mineral and dark that spoke of great depths below. Josephine was 3 feet ahead of him with a small oil lantern that she had uncovered from beneath a rock shelf, its flame burning steady and yellow in the still underground air. The passage they were in was not a crack so much as the beginning of a tunnel system, the ceiling high enough that he did not need to bow his head, the walls worn smooth by water that had moved through here for centuries. "Stay close," she said, already walking. "The first branch goes left. Do not take it. There is a sinkhole 15 feet down that passage that has no bottom anyone has found." "How do you know this place?" he asked, keeping pace with her. "Because I have been in this valley for 4 months," she said, "and I make it my business to know every exit from any place I find myself in." There was something in the way she said it that caught at him. Not fear exactly, but the echo of fear, the kind of knowledge that comes from having needed an exit badly and not finding one. He filed it away. He was good at filing things away. "You knew my name," he said. "I have been watching you for 2 days," she said, taking the right branch at the fork without hesitation. "I knew what you were when you came into the valley, a bounty hunter working alone, experienced, cautious. I watched how you moved. You are Wallace Easton. There is a description of you at every sheriff's office in 3 territories, not because you are wanted, because you are known." "You read law office notices," he said. "I read everything," she said, and there was something in the steadiness of her voice that made him believe her absolutely. "The next section is low. Duck your head." He ducked. The passage narrowed and lowered for 20 feet, and then opened again into a chamber that made him stop walking and simply stand still for a moment. because it was the most unexpected thing he had encountered in 12 years of moving through the West's most remarkable landscape. The chamber was perhaps 60 feet across and 30 feet high, and the ceiling was hung with formations of pale limestone that caught the lamplight and threw it back in 1,000 directions. An underground stream ran along the chamber's far edge, dark and quick and purposeful. The air was cold and clean and tasted of limestone and deep earth. "How far does this go?" he asked. "Far enough," Josephine said. The main tunnel follows the old underground river course for approximately 2 miles and exits on the eastern face of the ridge, above the flood line, below the sight lines of Creed's men on the northern rim. You will come out in a box canyon that connects to the eastern Mesa Road. You can be in Caldera before midnight. He looked at her. The lamplight made the planes of her face complex, throwing shadows that emphasized the precision of her features and the quality of her attention. She was looking at him the way a physician looks at a patient, assessing, reading, processing information with a calm thoroughness that he found simultaneously disorienting and compelling. "You are a healer," he said. It was not quite a guess. The satchel on her back had the specific worn, heavy look of a medical bag. There was a smell about her, not unpleasant, that spoke of dried herbs and something antiseptic, the coal tar soap that frontier surgeons favored. "I practice medicine," she said. "I also set broken bones, pull teeth, deliver children, treat infected wounds, and manage epidemic illness. In a territory where the nearest physician is 90 miles away, the definition of healer tends to be comprehensive." "What are you doing in Creed's Valley?" She was quiet for a moment. They had started moving again, following the underground stream, and the lamplight moved with them through the dark in a warm circle that felt, in the context of the last 36 hours of cold survival, almost obscenely comfortable. "There is a mining settlement on the eastern side of the ridge," she said. 43 men and 11 women and 14 children. Creed controls their water access. The creek that feeds their settlement runs through his claimed land, and he has been diverting it systematically for 2 months, trying to force them off their claims. The adults are surviving on what they can carry from the eastern mesa. The children have been getting sick. 3 weeks ago, a child died of dysentery from contaminated water they had been forced to use from a stagnant pool. She paused. "I came because I received a letter asking for help. I came because a child died of a preventable disease, because of one man's greed and cruelty, and because no one with authority had done anything about it." The silence after her words had a particular weight to it. He thought about the bounty notice. He thought about $2,000. He thought about the child who had died of dysentery in the eastern settlement. "When did you arrive?" he asked. 4 months ago," she said. "I came in through the eastern route before Creed thought to watch it carefully. I have been working between the settlement and this valley since then. The underground passage I found by following the water sound during my first week. I mapped it over 3 separate expeditions." "You mapped it," he said. "Of course," she said, as though this were the obvious response to any unknown space, which he supposed it was if you were the kind of person she appeared to be. "Where are you from?" he asked. "St. Louis originally," she said. "I trained under Dr. Emmeline Ford, who was one of the first women granted a medical certificate by the Missouri State Board. I have been practicing on the frontier for 3 years. She glanced back at him. "I am 26 years old, if you are calculating whether my experience matches my confidence." He had not been calculating that precisely, but he had been doing something in that neighborhood, and the fact that she had read it and preempted it was startling enough that he laughed. It was a short sound, rusty from disuse but genuine. He could not remember the last time he had made that sound. "Wallace Easton laughing," she said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. "I was beginning to think your face was incapable of it." "You have been watching me for 2 days," he said. "You have a very expressive relationship with your landscape," she said. "You speak to the terrain, not out loud. But you look at a canyon wall the way most men look at a chess problem. I found it interesting. He thought about that as they moved deeper into the passage. No one had ever described him as interesting before. Dangerous, yes. Skilled, frequently. Effective by reputation. Interesting was a new category, and he was not entirely sure what to do with it. The tunnel turned south and then east, following a logic of its own that had nothing to do with the surface geography above them. The underground stream was louder here, rushing over a shelf of rock and dropping 6 feet into a pool before continuing on, and the sound of it filled the passage with a soft, continuous roar that was somehow calming rather than alarming. Josephine moved with the confidence of someone who had made this journey enough times that it had become routine, checking her bearings at each major formation, occasionally running her hand along the wall in a gesture that was half navigation and half something more personal, the gesture of someone who has made their peace with a place that frightened them initially. "You were frightened the first time," he said. She stopped and turned to look at him fully for the first time since they had entered the tunnel. The lamplight between them made the moment feel closer, more immediate than the space between them warranted. "Yes," she said simply. "The first time I went into the dark underground passage alone, I was terrified. I sat at the entrance for 20 minutes before I went in. A pause. I went in anyway." He held her gaze. There was something in that admission, in the straightforwardness of it and the lack of apology in it, that reached him in a way that he could not have described precisely. She was not performing bravery. She was reporting the truth of her experience with the same clinical accuracy she brought to everything. And the truth was that she had been afraid, and had done the necessary thing regardless, because the child in the eastern settlement had died of dysentery and 43 men, and 11 women and 14 children needed water, and those facts outweighed her fear. He understood that calculus with his whole body, in the way that you understand things that mirror the secret architecture of your own character. "That is the bravest kind of courage," he said, and his voice came out quieter than he intended. She looked at him for one more moment before turning back to the tunnel. "Keep up," she said. "The passage narrows again ahead." The next hour of walking was conducted in a kind of companionable silence that Wallace would have sworn under any oath was impossible between two strangers in an underground tunnel, while armed men searched for them on the surface. But the silence between himself and Josephine Hale was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who were used to being alone, and who had discovered, in the space of an hour, that the company of the other person did not diminish the quality of their solitude but somehow enhanced it, the way good light enhances rather than diminishes a landscape. He learned things about her in that silence. She moved with a deliberate economy of motion that spoke of physical competence and practical training. She had excellent spatial orientation, turning at each branch of the tunnel system without hesitation or backtracking. When the passage brought them to a section where the ceiling dropped and the floor was covered with standing water 4 inches deep, she produced, from her satchel, a pair of waterproof leather overboots with no comment and put them on before wading through, then waited on the other side without impatience while he did the same without the benefit of overboots, his own boots being soaked through by the second step. She did not offer commentary on his lack of preparation. She simply waited. "You have done this before," he said, shaking water from his boot on the far side. 11 times, she said, each time carrying supplies to the settlement. "Alone," he said. "There was no one else available," she said. He looked at the passage they had come through, the low, dark, flooded section. 11 times, alone. Carrying supplies in the dark with a single lamp. Because a settlement of 43 men and 11 women and 14 children was cut off from their water supply, and a child had already died. Something that had been armored in him for a very long time shifted, the way a large stone shifts when the water underneath it finally reaches a critical level, not breaking, not collapsing, but moving, almost imperceptibly, in a direction it had not moved in years. They came up out of the earth an hour and 40 minutes after entering it. The exit was a narrow cleft in the eastern face of the ridge, partially concealed by a stand of juniper that had grown against the rock wall, and when Wallace emerged into the afternoon sunlight, the contrast with the underground dark was so complete that he stood blinking for a full 30 seconds while his vision adjusted. The air smelled of juniper and late afternoon warmth and the clean, distant scent of the eastern mesa. Below them, a box canyon opened onto a trail that he could see, even from this distance, connected to the eastern road. He was alive. He was out of the valley. He had 3 bullets and no plan, and he was standing on a mountainside with a frontier physician who had just navigated him through 2 miles of underground tunnel in the dark, and he had never in his life felt less certain about what happened next. "The settlement is 2 miles north," Josephine said, adjusting the satchel on her back. "There are people there who will be glad to see you, if your intention is what I believe it to be." "What do you believe it to be?" he asked. "I believe you came to this valley to pursue Dorian Creed's bounty," she said. "I believe that what you found here has complicated that intention. I believe you are the kind of man who, when presented with 43 people being starved out of their water supply, finds it difficult to ride past." He said nothing. "I am not asking you to be a hero," she said. "I am asking you to eat something, rest, and make an informed decision. I have medical supplies and enough provisions at the settlement for another week. You look like you have not slept in 2 days. 31 hours, he said. "Come," she said, and started down the slope toward the canyon without waiting to see if he followed. He followed. The eastern settlement was called Providence, and nothing about its name was ironic. It sat in a shallow depression at the base of the eastern mesa, sheltered from the worst of the wind by a curve of sandstone that curved around it like a cupped hand. There were perhaps 20 structures, most of them simple board and batten construction but solid and well-maintained, with kitchen gardens in various states of spring readiness behind them, and a central square where 3 children were playing with a dog when Wallace and Josephine came down the canyon trail. The children saw Josephine first and ran to her with the specific enthusiasm of people who have been waiting for relief. "Miss Josephine," a boy of perhaps 8 shouted, arriving first. "Thomas Greer cut his hand on the saw this morning. Ma has been trying to keep the bleeding down." "I will see him directly," Josephine said, and the quality of her voice changed when she spoke to the child, warmed without losing any of its precision, the way a lamp warms a room without changing its shape. "Is he steady?" "He was swearing a lot," the boy reported helpfully. "That is an excellent sign," Josephine said. "A man who is swearing is a man with good blood pressure." She looked at Wallace. "Come to the main house when you have seen to your horse." He did not have his horse. His horse was wherever Creed's men had left it after they ran him to ground in the canyon, and the thought of that animal in the hands of men like that sent a cold current through him. "My horse was in the northern canyon," he said. "I know where your horse is," a new voice said, and he looked up to find a man of perhaps 50, broad through the shoulders and gray at the temples, coming across the square toward him with the unhurried gait of a man who is used to making decisions. "I am Bernard Holt. I run this settlement. We found your animal yesterday morning, wandered into our eastern pasture. She is fine, well-fed, good horse." "Thank you," Wallace said, and meant it more than the 2 words could carry. Bernard Holt looked at him with the assessment of a man who had been judging other men's reliability for most of his life. "You are the bounty hunter Creed has been trying to kill for 2 days, he said. "That is accurate," Wallace said. "Josephine brought you out." "She did," Bernard nodded slowly. "Then you are under her judgment," he said, which was a peculiar way to put it, but which Wallace found he had no argument with. "Come, I will have someone see to your gear." The settlement received him with the careful warmth of people who had learned to be cautious with strangers, but who were desperate enough that they could not afford to be cautious for long. He was given a bunk in the men's quarters, a clean shirt from the settlement's common stores, and a meal that was simple and substantial in the way that frontier cooking at its best always was. cornbread and salt pork and dried apple preserves and coffee so strong it practically walked to the cup under its own power. He ate and he slept. He slept for 6 hours, which was more consecutive unconsciousness than he had permitted himself in 2.5 days, and when he woke the quality of the light told him it was early the following morning. Josephine was in the settlement's medical room when he found her, which was a separate structure from the main house, a small, clean, well-organized space that smelled of lye soap and dried herbs, and something else, something sharper and more clinical, that spoke of a level of pharmaceutical sophistication that surprised him. There were shelves along 2 walls holding labeled jars and bottles organized with a precision that would have been at home in a city apothecary. On a central work table, she had her medical implements laid out with the same precise organization: probe, forceps, lancet, suture needle and thread, and a copy of a medical text that she had opened beside her as she worked at something in a stone mortar. She had heard him come in or had expected him. "Good morning," she said without looking up. "How does your head feel? You took a graze in the second canyon. You did not mention it, but I saw blood on your collar yesterday." He reached up and felt the side of his head where she was indicating. There was a crusted line of dried blood above his left ear that he genuinely had not had time to consider. "It does not hurt," he said. "It will," she said. "Sit down." He sat. She came around the work table with clean water and a cloth and the brisk efficiency of a person doing something they have done 10,000 times, and she cleaned the wound with a care that was also, somehow, quick, and then she looked at it closely and made a sound that he was coming to recognize as her professional assessment of a problem. "It needs 2 sutures," she said. "Do what you need to do," he said. She did what she needed to do. He sat still while she put 2 small, precise sutures in the scalp wound, and he was aware, in the particular heightened way of a man who has been in enough physical danger that his senses had been running at maximum for 2 days, of her nearness, her focus, the cool, careful touch of her hands. She smelled of lye soap and something herbal, chamomile perhaps, and she worked with the kind of absolute concentration that made him feel, paradoxically, completely seen, the way a carpenter's examination of a flawed joint is a form of complete attention. "You did not tell me how you came to be in this situation," she said as she worked. 12 years of bounty hunting. "You have been doing this since you were 17. How do you know that?" he asked. "Bernard Holt keeps records," she said. "He has been corresponding with law offices across 3 territories for months, trying to find someone with both the authority and the ability to address Creed. Your name came up in a sheriff's dispatch from the Colorado Territory 8 months ago. You cleared a mining claim dispute in Gunnison County. You were described as one of the most effective independent deputies operating in the frontier territories." He thought about that. About the Gunnison case, which had been one of the uglier ones, a land rights dispute that had turned violent, that had cost him 3 weeks and a broken rib and left him with a permanent distrust of men who wore their money too visibly. "You have been planning for someone like me," he said. "For someone capable," she said, tying off the last suture with a small, precise knot. "I wrote to 4 different bounty hunters. 2 did not respond. 1 responded and then disappeared, which suggests Creed may have gotten to him first. You were the 4th. He went very still. "You wrote to me," he said. She met his eyes. "I wrote to you 3 months ago," she said. "Through the sheriff's contact in Harrow's Creek. I described the situation, the water diversion, the settlement circumstances, the bounty on Creed. I did not hear back." He turned this over in his mind. 3 months ago he had been in New Mexico, working a case near Santa Fe. His mail had been held at the Harrow's Creek Sheriff's Office, as it often was when he was working a long case in another territory. He had collected it in Harrow's Creek when he arrived, 4 days before entering the valley, and there had been nothing from a Josephine Hale in the bundle, or if there had been, it had not reached him. "Your letter never arrived," he said, "or it was intercepted." Josephine was quiet for a moment. "Someone in Harrow's Creek is working for Creed," she said. "I have suspected as much for 2 months. Letters I have sent to the circuit court and to the territory office in Santa Fe have not produced any response. Legal processes that should have begun have shown no movement. That is why he was expecting me, Wallace said, and the pieces fell together with a click that he felt physically. He knew I was coming because whoever is working for him in Harrow's Creek told him. That is how he knew to close the northern pass. That is my reading of it, she said. She sat across from him and placed her hands flat on the table in a gesture of directness. Which means that whatever you are going to do about Creed, you cannot do it through the official channels in Harrow's Creek. You cannot send for help through that route. Any communication you attempt will reach him first. I work alone, he said. Not this time, she said. The clarity in her voice was not aggressive. She was stating a fact of the situation with the same precision she applied to every other fact. This was not a negotiation. It was a briefing. And the fact of the matter was that she was right, and he knew she was right, and arguing with her would have been the kind of self-defeating masculine pride that got good men killed, and whatever else he was not a fool. "Tell me what you know," he said. She told him. She talked for 2 hours, and in those 2 hours he came to understand that Josephine Hale had, over the course of 4 months in and around a hostile valley controlled by a violent criminal, assembled a body of intelligence on Dorian Creed's operation that would have taken a professional Pinkerton operative twice as long. She knew his supply routes, his schedule, his key personnel, his hidden mine claims, his financial arrangements with a bank officer in Santa Fe, and the location of his camp within the valley. She had maps. She had actual, hand-drawn maps, rendered in a fine, precise hand on sheets of paper that had been protected in an oilcloth folder. He unfolded them on the table and spread them out and looked at them for a long time. They were extraordinary. Not just accurate, though they were that, showing the valley topography with a precision that matched his own surveyor's eye, but annotated with observations that revealed a systematic intelligence he had rarely encountered in a decade of working with informants and deputies and law officers. She had marked Creed's patrol patterns with timing notes. She had marked water sources, shadow positions at different times of day, the acoustic properties of different canyon sections where sound carried or did not carry. She had noted the rotation of his men, identified 3 who seemed reluctant participants, likely coerced local miners pressed into Creed's service, as distinct from his corps of 6 professional gunmen. "You made these," he said. "Over 4 months," she said. He looked up from the maps. He looked at her across the table, with the morning light coming in from the east-facing window and the smell of her medicines in the air, and the sound of the settlement coming to life outside, and something happened in his chest that was both entirely unexpected and, in retrospect, entirely inevitable. He was shocked. He was genuinely, deeply, completely shocked, not by the maps alone, but by the entire accumulated weight of her, by the intelligence and the courage and the systematic brilliance that had produced these documents in service of 43 people and 11 women and 14 children, and the shock of it went through him like a current, rearranging things. He had met capable women before. He had met brave women before. He had met intelligent women before. But he had never in his life met a woman who combined all of those things with such complete unself-consciousness, with no performance of her capability, no need for acknowledgement or credit, just the clean and functional exercise of remarkable gifts in service of people who needed help. It was the most impressive thing he had ever seen in 12 years of moving through a world full of impressive and terrible things. "These maps," he said carefully, "are the finest tactical intelligence documents I have ever seen. In 12 years I have worked with Pinkerton agents, military scouts, and experienced law officers. None of them have produced anything of this quality." She looked at him steadily. "I had 4 months and a significant motivation," she said. "That is not a sufficient explanation," he said. "This is exceptional work." Something shifted in her expression, something so subtle that he almost missed it, a brief softening around the eyes, a momentary relaxation of the careful professional composure. She was not accustomed to being told directly that her work was exceptional. He filed that too carefully. "What are you going to do with them?" she asked. He looked back at the maps. He thought about $2,000. He thought about 31 hours without sleep in a hostile canyon. He thought about a child dying of dysentery from a contaminated pool because one man had diverted a water supply. He thought about Josephine in the dark underground tunnel, her lamp steady, her voice steady, navigating him through the secret geography she had mapped with methodical courage over 4 months of solitary effort. "I am going to end this," he said. The planning took 3 days. 3 days in which Wallace and Josephine worked together at the table in her medical room, going over the maps with the focused intensity of a military campaign, identifying every element of advantage and every point of vulnerability. Bernard Holt participated in the planning meetings, along with 2 other settlement men named Cord Weston and James Alloway, who had militia experience from the war that had ended 15 years before. The plan that emerged was not simple. It was, in fact, the most complex tactical operation Wallace had undertaken in his career. But it was also, he gradually understood, elegant in the way that Josephine's maps were elegant, built on thorough knowledge rather than brute force, designed to achieve maximum effect with minimum exposure. The key insight was hers. Creed's men on the ridge did not know about the underground passage. They had sealed the northern pass to trap Wallace in the valley, believing the flood-swollen southern route made the valley impassable from the west. What they did not know was that the eastern ridge was, from their perspective, the side away from their watch, and that a well-organized group entering through the underground passage could approach Creed's camp from the unexpected direction. What Josephine had also identified, with characteristic precision, was that Creed's legal position was not as secure as his physical position. He held the valley by force, but the mineral claims of the Providence settlement were registered and documented in the Territory Office in Santa Fe. The problem was that his contact in Harrow's Creek had been intercepting or suppressing all communications to Santa Fe. The solution was to send documentation by a different route, by a rider who went north to the Ute trading post at Red Mesa, and from there caught the Federal Mail route, bypassing Harrow's Creek entirely. James Alloway volunteered for the ride. He left on the second night, carrying a package that Josephine had assembled with careful documentation of Creed's water diversion, the Providence claims, and a formal request for federal marshals to be dispatched. The package also contained a sealed letter from Wallace authorizing the request under his standing as a deputy tracker with a current commission from the Colorado Territory, a commission that, unlike his physical presence in the valley, had not been compromised. While they waited for the federal response, which would take at minimum 2 weeks, they prepared the secondary option, because waiting 2 weeks was not guaranteed to be safe. During those 3 days of planning, Wallace Easton fell in love with Josephine Hale. He did not know exactly when it happened. It was not a single moment but an accumulation of them, like a change in weather that is not visible in any single cloud but becomes undeniable as the sky shifts. It was the way she presented problems with all their complexity, without dramatization or false simplicity. It was the quality of her attention during their working sessions, complete and focused, and moving across information with a speed that he had to work to keep pace with. It was the way she spoke to the settlement children, with the same precision and respect she used with adults, because she did not condescend to people based on age or station. It was the small things, the way she kept her workspace organized not for appearance but for function, the way she brewed her coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in, the way she sat very still when she was thinking, not performing stillness but genuinely occupied by interior space. It was also the conversations they had in the evenings, when the planning was done and Bernard Holt and Cord Weston had gone back to their homes, and the settlement had settled into its nighttime quiet. They sat on the steps of the medical building and drank coffee, and talked in the manner of two people who had been alone long enough that conversation, when it finally came with someone worth talking to, spilled out with an almost physical relief. She told him about St. Louis and about training under Dr. Ford, who had been ferocious and exacting and brilliant, and who had told her on the first day of her training that she would be treated as exactly half as competent as any male student, and would therefore need to be twice as good, and who had prepared her to be twice as good with a rigor that had been, at the time, brutal and, in retrospect, the greatest gift anyone had ever given her. She told him about the year she had spent in a city hospital before coming west, about the sheer concentrated weight of suffering she had encountered there, and the inadequacy of the medical resources to address it, and about the moment she had understood that the frontier, for all its dangers and privations, was a place where one capable physician could have an effect that 100 could not have in a city already thick with medical institutions. "You chose to come west," he said. "I chose to come where I was most useful," she said. "That is not altruism, that is mathematics." "You are the most unusual woman I have ever met," he said. She looked at him with a direct, clear-eyed skepticism. "That is either a compliment or a polite way of saying I make you uncomfortable," she said. "Both," he said, and when she laughed, the sound of it hit him somewhere in the chest with a warm, disorienting force. Her laugh was real and unguarded, quick and bright and gone quickly, but while it lasted, it was the most genuine thing he had heard in a very long time. He told her things that he had not told people in years, because the habit of solitude and the necessity of protecting operational information, and the general frontier preference for reticence, had combined to make him a man who did not talk much about himself. He told her about his father's ranch and the massacre that had ended it, which had been the work of a land-grabbing railroad consortium, rather than any of the more romantic frontier violences. Hired men who had burned the buildings and killed the cattle and left the family ruined, and who had been clever enough about it that the law had never touched them. He told her about Cole Marsh, the bounty hunter who had taken him in, a hard and principled man who had taught him everything that his father and the frontier had not already taught him, and who had died of a stroke in a sheriff's office in Wyoming when Wallace was 22, leaving him a horse and a revolver and a reputation and nothing else of substance. "Is that why you kept moving?" she asked. "Partly," he said, "and partly because I was good at it. And partly because I had not found a place worth stopping." The silence after that sentence had a different quality from the silences that had preceded it. He had said too much, or exactly enough. He was not sure which. He could feel her considering it with the same careful attention she brought to everything. "There is something worth stopping for here," she said quietly. "Not only in the romantic sense, though I suspect you may be thinking in that direction as well." A pause during which he did not move. "This territory needs what you can do the way it needs what I can do, not in passing, permanently. There is a federal marshal's district forming. Bernard received a letter 6 weeks ago asking if there was anyone in this area who might be considered for a deputy marshal appointment." He had not expected the conversation to pivot to appointments. The pivot itself was characteristic of her, her ability to hold the personal and the practical in the same breath without diminishing either. He recognized it as the same thing that made her so effective at everything else she did. "You are suggesting I stop moving," he said. "I am suggesting you consider whether there is more value in staying than in going," she said. "I am staying. I accepted a permanent appointment from 3 settlements in this territory 8 months ago. I am building something here. A practice, a network, eventually a proper clinic when we can raise the funds." She paused. "I think you could build something here too." He looked at the stars above the eastern mesa, which were the dense and particular stars of high desert, brilliant and close and innumerable. He thought about 12 years of moving, and the accumulating weight of solitude and the way this valley, which had tried to kill him, had also given him 3 evenings on these steps with this woman and the closest thing to genuine conversation he had had in longer than he could clearly remember. "Let us finish this first," he said. "Yes," she said. Let us finish this first. The operation was set for the following week. James Alloway had not yet returned, which meant the federal marshals had not been dispatched, which meant the secondary option was the operative one. The plan called for a night entry through the underground tunnel, 2 hours before dawn, with Wallace, Cord Weston, and Bernard Holt entering the valley and approaching Creed's camp from the east while Josephine waited at the tunnel exit with the medical kit. Because while she had argued with characteristic precision and evident frustration that she should be part of the active team, Wallace had argued back with equal conviction that her skills were most valuable in the role of emergency care provider, and that the loss of her medical capacity in the event that she was injured or captured would be a strategic loss that outweighed any tactical contribution she could make in the assault itself. She had looked at him for a long, measured moment and then said, "That argument is logical and I resent it," and agreed to wait at the tunnel exit. He had never been more attracted to her in his life than in the moment she chose logic over pride. They went in on a moonless night in the third week of April 1882, in the high Utah Territory, with the air carrying the last cold of the spring nights and the smell of sage and the faint chemical ghost of black powder from the demolished northern pass. The underground tunnel was dark and familiar by now, Wallace having made 2 practice runs to orient himself, and he moved through it with a confidence he had not possessed on the first crossing, the formations and branching points and the flooded section all known to him. He carried his Colt, freshly cleaned and fully loaded with ammunition from the settlement stores, and a Winchester rifle that Bernard Holt had pressed on him the day before with the quiet authority of a man making a gift without discussion. Cord Weston carried his own Winchester, and a considerable personal reputation for calm under fire. Bernard Holt carried a shotgun and the specific, steady courage of a man protecting his community. They came out of the eastern ridge into the pre-dawn dark and moved along the base of the canyon wall toward Creed's camp, with the silence of men who had agreed that silence was survival. Wallace's mind moved alongside his body as it always did in operations, systematically checking angles and sightlines and the placement of Josephine's mapped patrol positions, and finding, with a continuous low-level relief, that the map was accurate. It was accurate to a degree that felt almost impossible. The guard positions were exactly where she had placed them. The timing of the rotation was exactly what she had documented. The path through the camp's outer perimeter was precisely where she had shown it. He had been in 14 significant field operations in his career. He had worked with law officers who had years of territorial service and with military men who had trained specifically for this kind of work. Not one of them had provided him with field intelligence of this accuracy. He thought about her at the tunnel mouth, waiting in the dark with her medical kit, and the thought of her steadied him the way almost nothing else had ever steadied him. The confrontation with Creed was not what any novel or dime magazine story would have made of it. It was not a clean drawdown in the street at high noon. It was a morning arrest at 5:45, with Creed's camp still half asleep, and his men reduced to 4 active guards, the other 4, Josephine had noted in her intelligence, keeping late hours and sleeping in on alternating days. Creed himself was in his main tent, and when Wallace pulled back the tent flap and put his rifle on the man's chest while Cord and Bernard dealt with the outer guards, the expression on Creed's face was a compound of terror and a fury that had nowhere to go. "Wallace Easton," Creed said. His voice was still trying for authority. "The same," Wallace said. "Dorian Creed. You are under arrest for the robbery and murder charges listed in the territory warrant. You will come with me now." "I sealed the pass," Creed said, and there was something almost bewildered in his voice. "There is no way out of the valley." "There was one you did not know about," Wallace said. The 3 reluctant guards, the local miners Josephine had correctly identified as coerced participants, surrendered without resistance the moment Creed was secured. The 3 professional gunmen were a different matter. But the element of surprise and the precision of Josephine's patrol timing had given Wallace, Cord, and Bernard the positions they needed, and the operation concluded, after a tense 40-minute negotiation, with all three in custody and no lives lost. One of Cord Weston's arms was grazed by a bullet, and he was cursing extensively about it. But by Josephine's later assessment, the wound was superficial and the cursing was disproportionate to the injury. They brought Creed and his captured men back through the valley on foot, because the horses were held in a corral near the northern blockage, and using them would have required passing through the demolished pass section. Instead, they marched south to the emergency route Josephine had mapped along the valley's secondary creek bed, which, with Creed's diversion structures dismantled, would drain properly within days. They emerged onto the eastern Mesa Road in the mid-morning sun, with Creed in irons and his men bound at the wrists, and Josephine was waiting at the Box Canyon entrance with her medical bag and a canteen of water that she distributed with practical efficiency. She examined Cord's arm with the professional thoroughness that made him stop cursing long enough to look embarrassed, cleaned it, wrapped it, and told him the cursing had been excessive. "It hurt," Cord said. "Of course it did," she said. "Most things that require courage also hurt. The two facts are not in contradiction." She looked at Wallace over Cord's shoulder as she finished the bandaging, and her eyes were clear and steady, and there was in them something that was not relief so much as recognition, the specific expression of a person seeing something they had hoped for come true. "Are you all right?" she asked him, because he had a cut on his chin and dried blood on his jacket that suggested some additional physical contact with the situation that had not been in the plan. "I am fine," he said. "You are going to need that wound cleaned," she said. "I know," he said. They looked at each other in the morning sunlight at the mouth of the Box Canyon, with the smell of sage and open air all around them, and the eastern mesa stretching away to the horizon, and 5 men in custody between them and Bernard Holt and Cord Weston, and Wallace Easton said the only thing that felt true and adequate to the moment. "Thank you," he said. She knew he did not mean only for the tunnel. Her eyes said she knew. "You are welcome," she said, and the words carried all the weight of 4 months of maps and 11 tunnel crossings alone in the dark, and a dead child in the eastern settlement, and everything that had led to this morning. James Alloway returned 6 days later with 2 federal marshals from the Santa Fe district, having ridden hard in both directions, and arrived to find the situation already resolved. The marshals took custody of Creed and his men, which represented the beginning of a legal process that would eventually, over the following months, result in convictions, the restoration of Providence Settlement's water rights, and the formal nullification of Creed's falsely registered mineral claims. The man in Harrow's Creek who had been working for Creed, an Assyr named Garrett Fry, was identified through the financial records that the marshals seized from Creed's camp, the same records that Josephine had noted in her intelligence files as existing and being stored in the camp's document tent. He was arrested 2 weeks later and charged with obstruction and conspiracy. That case too would find its resolution in the territory courts. In the days that followed the arrest, and while the marshals processed the custody transfer, Wallace remained in Providence. It was, he told himself initially, because there were documents to sign and depositions to make and the administrative weight of the operation to process. This was true. It was not the whole truth. He helped Bernard Holt's team dismantle the water diversion structures that Creed's men had built in the Valley Creek. It was physical, satisfying work, pulling out the log and stone dams that had redirected the water away from the settlement's supply, watching the creek bed begin to fill again with the clean, purposeful flow that was its natural state. By the 3rd day, the water was running clear into the settlement's supply channel, and the sound of it, constant and steady, had a quality that was almost musical. Josephine's mood in those days was different from the focused, mission-oriented intensity of the planning and operation period. She was still working, because her work never entirely stopped. 3 settlers needed regular medical attention. A woman named Sarah Holt, Bernard's wife, was 3 months from delivery, and the general spring season always brought the particular medical business of people who had been surviving winter hardship and needed their various accumulating complaints addressed. But in the evenings, when the work was done, she was lighter, and the quality of the lightness was the quality of someone who has been carrying a great weight and has set it down at last. They walked in those evenings. The settlement surroundings on the eastern mesa offered good walking, long views across the canyon country to the west and south, the sky performing its usual spectacular late-day work above the desert geology, colors moving through the spectrum from gold to copper to the deep, complex purple that precedes full dark. They talked more freely now. The operational intensity was behind them, and what remained was the more ordinary, more difficult, more essential work of 2 people finding their way toward each other. One evening, a week after the arrest, they were sitting on a flat-topped sandstone ledge above the settlement, watching the sun make its descent into the western canyon country, when Josephine said, without preamble, "What are you going to do?" He knew what she meant. The question had been present between them for days, shaping the conversations around it the way a stone shapes water. "I have been thinking about the deputy marshal appointment," he said. She was quiet, looking at the west. "The territory is forming a district," he said. "The appointment would be based out of Caldera, which is 1 day's ride from Providence. The salary is modest, but the work is the same work I have been doing. More structured, more permanent." He paused. "It would keep me in this territory." "Yes," she said, "it would." He turned to look at her. The copper light of the declining sun was on her face, and she was looking at the western landscape with an expression he had been learning to read over 10 days of evenings together, the interior expression, the thinking expression, the one that preceded something honest. "Josephine," he said. She turned. "I am not a man who is accustomed to saying things that matter to him directly," he said. "I have spent 12 years in a line of work that rewards silence and punishes vulnerability, and I have gotten very good at both habits. I am going to try to do something different." "That is a commendable introduction," she said. "I am in love with you," he said. "I have been trying to be precise about when it happened, and I cannot name the exact moment. But I know it was somewhere between the tunnel exit and those maps on the table in your medical room, and probably it had been building before that, from the moment you appeared out of the rock wall and told me to move. You are the most extraordinary person I have ever met, and I am aware that is not a small statement given that I have met a great many people in a great many places." She looked at him for a long, unguarded moment. The copper light turned the gray-green of her eyes to something warmer and more complex, and she was doing the thing she did where she considered something completely before responding, and he waited, because he had learned that her consideration was always worth waiting for. "I have been in love with you," she said, "since you sat still without flinching while I put sutures in your scalp, and then told me the maps were the finest tactical intelligence you had ever seen. Not because of the compliment, because of what the compliment told me about how you look at people." He let that settle in him. The warm, complete, uncomplicated joy of it was something he had not felt in so long that it had almost no name left, but his body recognized it anyway, the way the body recognizes things that are essential to it. "I have a proposal," he said, "and I want you to know that I understand it may be too soon by most conventional measures, and I will not be anything but grateful regardless of your answer." "Proposals generally benefit from being made directly," she said. "Marry me," he said. The sun was in the last 10 degrees of its descent, and the light was the color of old copper, and the desert was utterly still around them. And Josephine Hale looked at Wallace Easton with all of her considerable intelligence and all of her hard-won courage and all of the warmth that she had been protecting under layers of professional competence and practical necessity, and she said, "Yes." He kissed her in that copper light, and the kiss had in it 12 years of his solitude and 4 months of her singular, courageous purpose, and the underground tunnel that had been the beginning of everything between them, and the maps, and the evenings on the steps, and the stars above the high desert, and the sound of the restored creek running clean through the settlement, and the enormous, uncomplicated, necessary fact of having found someone who met you at your full height and asked nothing less. They were married in June of 1882 in the settlement of Providence, in the open air of the eastern mesa, with the canyon country spread out behind them and every resident of the settlement present, including Sarah Holt, who was 6 months along by then, and sat in the chair that Bernard had carried out of the main house and refused to leave, because she said that a wedding between those two people was not an event she intended to miss for any reason, including advanced pregnancy. The ceremony was performed by a circuit minister named Whitfield, who passed through the territory every 2 months, and who found the couple, in his own words, the most unusually prepared pair he had ever married, meaning that they had clearly already discussed everything that most couples only begin to discuss after the ceremony, and that the vows they exchanged, which they had written themselves, were specific and honest in a manner that went beyond the conventional formula. Wallace Easton accepted the deputy marshal appointment for the Caldera district in July of the same year. The appointment came with a reasonable salary, a defined territory, and the specific satisfaction of work he was suited for deployed in service of communities he had come to care about. His jurisdiction included Providence and the surrounding settlements, which meant that he was, for the first time in his adult life, consistently in the same place. The consistency surprised him. He had been so thoroughly formed by 12 years of movement that he had assumed, without examining the assumption carefully, that stillness would feel like confinement. It did not. It felt like finally choosing to put down roots after carrying the seeds everywhere and wondering why nothing grew. It felt like the specific pleasure of knowing a landscape so thoroughly that you could move through it in the dark, the way Josephine moved through her medical work, with the confidence of deep knowledge. He still rode hard miles. The district was large and the work was genuine, and there were still men in the territory who needed to be found and brought to legal account. But he came back. He came back to the house they had built at the eastern edge of Providence, on a rise with a view of the canyon country that in the evenings was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, except for the woman who sometimes came to stand beside him and look at it. Josephine's practice grew. The clinic she had spoken of, with its characteristic clarity and purpose, took shape over the following year and a half, funded by a combination of donations from the settlements she served and a small grant from the territory's new public health program. It was not large. It had 3 rooms, a waiting area, an examination room, and a surgery, and it was equipped with the best instruments she could obtain through a correspondence with a medical supply house in St. Louis. She hired an assistant, a young woman named Clara who had some nursing training from a church hospital in Denver, and she trained Clara with the same rigorous thoroughness that Dr. Emmeline Ford had trained her, because that was the only method she knew, and she had evidence that it worked. The child that Josephine had spoken of, the one who had died of dysentery in the eastern settlement in the winter before the crisis, was named Daniel Greer, and he had been 6 years old. Josephine had never met him, had only heard of him in the letter that had brought her west. But she had built the clinic in his name, had put a small carved wooden plaque above the door that bore his name and his dates, and when anyone asked her why, she told them simply that the dead deserved to be remembered by the living improvements made in their names, and that every clean water supply and every healthy child in this territory was a continuation of what Daniel Greer's brief life had pointed toward. Wallace found her one morning standing in front of that plaque, not crying. Josephine Hale was not, in his experience, a woman who cried easily, but still, in the particular way she stood with her hands clasped in front of her and her head slightly bent. He stood beside her without speaking, After a moment she leaned into him, just slightly, a small, unconscious lean, and his arm went around her in the easy, practiced way of a man who has been married long enough that the gesture is reflexive. "He would have been 8, she said. "Yes," he said. "The water has been running clean for a year," she said. "All the children in the eastern settlement are healthy." "Yes," he said. She straightened. "Good," she said. "I have 2 patients coming this morning." She went back inside, and he stood another moment in front of the plaque, reading the name, and then he went to the stables to saddle his horse for the day's ride. In the spring of 1883, Josephine told him she was pregnant. She told him in her characteristic way, which was to say she sat him down at the kitchen table after dinner and provided him with the information directly and completely, including her estimated date, the current state of her health, which was excellent, and her plan for managing the practice during the later months of her pregnancy, which involved increasing Clara's responsibilities and training a second assistant from among the settlement women. He looked at her across the table in the lamplight and felt, for the 10th or the 100th time, the specific and irreducible joy of her, the way she inhabited every moment of her life with her full intelligence and her full honesty and her full self. "Are you pleased?" she asked, watching him with those clear, steady eyes. "I am profoundly, completely pleased," he said. "I am also terrified." "Terrified is appropriate," she said. "I am also terrified. I have delivered 63 children in 3 years of frontier practice, and I am still terrified about this particular one. That is also normal. Come here." He came around the table and she took his hands in hers, which were warm and strong and familiar to him now in every mood and season. "It is going to be fine," she said, and because she said it with the authority of someone who had delivered 63 children and who had studied the evidence carefully, he believed her. Their son was born in December of 1883, and they named him Daniel Marshall Easton. The Marshall was for Cole Marsh, who had given Wallace a direction when he had none, and the Daniel was for the boy who had died and who had been the first point of the chain that had brought them to this place. The name was Josephine's idea, and he had agreed to it immediately and completely. Daniel arrived on a cold December morning during a light snowfall, born in their house with Josephine managing the medical aspects of her own labor with a degree of self-possessed competence that Clara, her assistant, later described to the settlement women as the most impressive thing she had ever witnessed, and Josephine later described as the most painful thing she had ever experienced and the best. Wallace held his son for the first time in the gray winter light of the bedroom window, and the child was very small and very loud and smelled of milk and new life. And Wallace Easton, who had been hardened by 12 years of violent frontier work, and by a childhood ended too soon by cruelty and fire, sat down on the edge of the bed beside his exhausted, radiant wife and wept quietly, without apology, and Josephine put her hand on the back of his neck and held it there until he was done. And neither of them said anything about it because nothing needed to be said. The years passed with the quality that good years have, which is that they pass both too quickly and exactly as they should, full of the ordinary, extraordinary material of a life built in a place you have chosen with someone you have chosen. Wallace's district work expanded as the territory was formalized, and the federal marshal's office established a proper regional headquarters in Caldera. He was offered a senior deputy appointment and took it, which came with 2 men under his command and a significantly broader jurisdiction, but which he negotiated to keep his base in Providence, because his wife's clinic was in Providence, and because Providence was home in the specific and unchallengeable way that home is when you have found it after a long time without it. Josephine's clinic became, by 1885, the most comprehensive medical facility in the eastern Utah Territory outside of the city of Salt Lake. She had written and published a paper on water purification techniques appropriate to frontier settlements that had been reprinted in 3 medical journals and distributed by the Territory Public Health Office to settlements across the region. The paper cited, Among other cases, the epidemic conditions at Providence Settlement in the winter of 1881 and 1882, and the preventable death of a child named Daniel Greer, and what it had taught about the relationship between water access, power, and community health. She had sent a copy to Dr. Emmeline Ford in St. Louis, and Ford had written back with a single sentence that Josephine kept pinned to the wall of her examination room. "You have exceeded everything I trained you for, which means I trained you exactly right." In 1885, they had a second child, a daughter they named Emmeline Josephine, who arrived in the summer with the minimum of complication and the maximum of personality, making her preferences known with a vocal authority that suggested she had inherited certain dominant traits from both parents. Daniel, who was 18 months old, received his sister with the philosophical equanimity of a small child who has been prepared by his parents for a significant change, and has found, upon its arrival, that it is less alarming than advertised. Bernard and Sarah Holt became the children's informal grandparents, filling a gap that the geographical distance of any living family left open, and the relationship was one of those practical frontier arrangements that become, with time, indistinguishable from the real thing in every way that matters. Sarah's own daughter, born in the fall of 1882, was one of Daniel's first friends, and the Holt and Easton households maintained the kind of daily proximity that made formal visiting unnecessary and informal company constant. Cord Weston, whose grazed arm had long since healed with no lasting effect beyond a faint scar that he displayed with considerable drama, became one of Wallace's most reliable deputies, riding the district with a competence and a dry humor that made the long miles easier. James Alloy, who had ridden the critical message to the federal marshals and who had made the whole legal resolution possible, stayed in Providence and became its primary rancher, expanding a small cattle operation into one of the more successful enterprises in the Eastern Territory. The underground tunnel, Josephine's discovery and her secret route, and the passage that had changed both of their lives, was eventually documented in a formal survey of the valley after the legal proceedings were complete and the valley was reopened for settlement. The survey crew found it exactly where her maps showed it, running its 2-mile course through the limestone below the eastern ridge, and the surveyor included a note in his report that the route had been previously identified and mapped by Dr. Josephine Hale Easton of the Providence Settlement, and that her documentation had been sufficiently accurate that the survey found no material discrepancy between her maps and the physical passage. Wallace read that note in the survey report sitting at the kitchen table with Daniel in his lap and Emmeline asleep in the next room and the smell of Josephine's dinner on the stove, and he smiled, wide and unguarded, the smile of a man with no armor left that he wants to put back on. "The surveyor cited your maps," he called. She came to the doorway with a wooden spoon in her hand. "Did he?" she said. "Word for word," he said. "Sufficient accuracy to find no material discrepancy." She considered this with the expression that meant she was pleased but was organizing the pleasure into the appropriate context. "That is satisfying," she said. "It is more than satisfying," he said. "It is the most understated sentence I have ever read in a government document." She smiled at him, and the smile was warm and real and entirely unguarded, the smile of a woman who is exactly where she intended to be. "Come to dinner," she said. He came to dinner. He set Daniel in the high chair that Bernard Holt had made in the settlement's workshop, a sturdy, well-made piece of furniture that would outlast all of them by decades if treated well, and he sat at the table that he had built himself from eastern pine in the first winter after their marriage, and Josephine set food before them, cornbread and beans and salt pork and dried apple preserves, which was the meal she had been feeding him since the first night in Providence, and which had, through pure association, become the most comforting food in his experience, and he poured coffee for both of them from the pot on the stove and looked at his family in the lamplight of their kitchen. He thought about the canyon wall with the bullet hole 3 inches from his skull. He thought about the darkness of the underground tunnel and the steady light of a single lamp moving ahead of him. He thought about the moment he had unfolded those extraordinary maps on a table in a frontier medical room and understood, with a shock that went through him like cold water, that the most impressive thing he had ever encountered in a long career of encountering remarkable things was a woman with dark hair and gray-green eyes who had mapped an underground river system alone in the dark over 4 months because 43 people needed help, and she was the help that was available. He thought about what she had said that first night on the medical building steps. There is something worth stopping for here. She had been right about everything else. She had been right about that too. What are you thinking? Josephine asked, watching him across the table with the particular precision of a woman who knows her husband's silences well enough to distinguish their types. I am thinking about the valley, he said. Which part of it? The part where you told me to move, he said. And I moved. She looked at him for a moment, and then she reached across the table and put her hand over his, warm and steady. The hands that had sutured him and mapped passages and delivered children and built a clinic and written a medical paper that had changed how settlements across a territory treated their water supplies. The hands that had, in all practical terms, changed his life by appearing out of a rock wall in a hostile canyon and offering him a way out. You have come a long way from that canyon, she said. We both have, he said. She squeezed his hand once and released it and went back to her dinner, and Daniel made a determined and largely successful attempt at the cornbread, and the lamp on the table burned steady in the still kitchen air, and outside the house the eastern mesa stretched away under the April stars, and somewhere 2 miles through the limestone of the eastern ridge, the underground river ran on in the dark, clean and purposeful and eternal, as it had run for 10,000 years before either of them were born. And as it would run for 10,000 years after, carrying the cold, deep water of the mountain through the secret geography of the earth, finding its way through passages that no one knew were there until someone brave enough and careful enough and brilliant enough went into the dark with a lamp and discovered them. Wallace Easton had thought the valley had no exit. He had been wrong about the valley. He had been wrong about the solitude. He had been wrong, in the best possible way, about what a life spent moving could become when it found its destination. Josephine Hale had shown him the underground route, and it had led him, through 2 miles of dark and the accumulated courage of a woman who went into the dark anyway, to exactly the place he had been meant to be. He ate his dinner. He drank his strong coffee. He watched his son work at the cornbread with the focused determination of an 18-month-old who has inherited 2 parents' stubborn competence. He listened to the particular nighttime music of the eastern mesa, the wind coming off the canyon country and the last calls of the desert birds settling into their roosts, and the small, constant, restored sound of the settlement creek running clean in the darkness. He was home. He had been lost for 12 years in the most beautiful and dangerous country in the world, and he had been looking, without knowing he was looking, for the thing that would make the movement stop feeling like flight and start feeling like choice. He had found it in an underground passage in a hostile valley, following a lamp held by a woman who was brave enough and brilliant enough and kind enough to go into the dark for the sake of people she did not yet know. He thought he might spend the rest of his life being grateful for it, and that the rest of his life would be, by all the evidence currently before him, a very good one. Outside, the April stars over the Utah territory were the dense and particular stars of high desert, brilliant and close and innumerable, and Wallace Easton, deputy marshal, husband, father, former solitary and now thoroughly, gratefully settled man, finished his dinner and felt the simple, complete, anchoring weight of everything he had found, and the simple, complete, anchoring knowledge that he was not going to lose it.